Chapter 30. The stud didn't fail him when a week later he had one of his narrowest escapes. He had reached the upper waters of Powder River and was in the heart of Crowland when his senses told him he was being followed. He had seen no fresh Indian tracks and no ashes of recent fires. On his way up he had rolled in sage and rubbed various plant essences over his weapons, the saddle, and the horse. He had made no fire since entering Crow country. He looked round him and studied the physical situation. Powder River flowed north through a lovely valley, with the Bighorns on the west and the Black Hills on the east. It was prime buffalo land. Except for the growth along the river, there was no heavy cover between him and the foothills, 30 or 40 miles distant. He thought of hiding and waiting and trying to shoot the leader of his horse, but his sixth sense told him that wouldn't be enough to stop them. They were desperate, and they were bolder than they had been. If he were to shoot one in a party of 4 or 5, he would then have to ride at top speed while reloading, and all the while they would be firing at his horse. At the post he had been told that his pack-horse was such a well-trained beast that he could turn him loose and he would follow. He guessed he would have to do that, for in a race for his life he couldn't hang onto the rope of a pack-horse. While thinking of his problem and wondering why he was here, he kept a sharp eye on the landscape and studied the river. He thought his best chance was to plunge into the river and cross and flee to the mountains. A few moments later he was no longer allowed to sit and think. A decision was abruptly forced on him. A mile southwest of him an Indian rider appeared on the crest of a hill. In no time at all there were 2, then 3, and 4, and at last there were 7. He could tell that it was a war party in full paint, well horsed and well armed. He supposed that they were all picked warriors. Pretending not to see them, he now followed the river path at a slow pace and studied the river bottoms. The river along here had cut deep in the earth and was 15 or 20 feet below the top of its bank. Would his horse take a leap from that height? Would the pack-horse follow? Most of his fixins were on the pack-horse, as well as Kate's rifle and food for her. The 7 Indians had disappeared. Sam would have risen to an elevated spot and waited for them, but there was none around him. He now took a branch path leading toward the river, which was 50 yards from him, and leaving his horses, he went back to the main trail. When at the edge of the woods he peered out, he had a good view of the country, except the river bottom. The main buffalo trail here skirted the edge of the woods, with many paths meandering through them. He knew that 7 Indians wouldn't try to approach him on horses. Some would detour and come in front from the north. Others would come up from the south, and somewhere they would have a lookout watching the river. He still had time to plunge in and cross while they were scouting his position, but he had never run from a fight, and he didn't like to run from this one. There were only 7 of them, he told himself, and Lost Scalp would say they were only an hour's work for a boy. He was thinking bravado, and he knew it. He wondered a moment if the ordeal of captivity and flight had impaired his faculties, for he didn't seem to be his usual self. Convinced that he was being stupid, he ran to the horses, led the pack-horse to the edge, and with one heave shoved him off. He then mounted, faced the river, dug with his heels, and with no hesitation at all the beast made the plunge to the swirling waters. The horse went under and Sam with it, except his right hand, which held his rifle high. The moment his eyes came up out of the water and he had shaken the wet off his lashes, he saw something that so astounded him that he could only stare. On the high bank above him stood a naked Indian, with nothing on him but some kind of headdress, and nothing in his hands but an object that looked like a knife. If Sam was astonished by sight of the red youth, he was utterly amazed by what the youth now did. He stood only an instant on the bank, tall and red and naked, when with the war cry of his people he put the knife between his teeth and plunged in, and at once was swimming like an otter, his absurd headdress and the knife flashing above the waters. Sam's horse was swimming toward the far bank, almost side by side with the pack horse. Sam hung his rifle from the horn, swung his right leg across the beast's neck, and turned in the saddle to face the swimmer. The stud was a strong one, but the Indian was gaining. As Sam watched the headdress coming closer, he could no longer doubt the incredible fact that this brave, a mere youngster, was determined to count coup on Sam Minard. Because it was not Sam's way to shoot an almost defenseless enemy, he loosened the knife at his belt. He then waited, eyes staring, his mind slowly grasping the fact that this was the most spectacular act of courage he had ever seen. As the Indian came on, the black eyes never left Sam's face. Sam saw more than that. He sensed that this young one had been so outraged in his tribal and personal pride that he was resolved to prove that a Crow warrior could be a braver man than the Terror. If able to touch Sam, he would in the next moment plunge the knife, and if he died in the next instant, would that matter? He would be remembered by his people as the bravest warrior of them all, living and dead. Well now, Sam thought. Having decided what was in the youth's mind, he moved fast. If this young brave wanted a fight with knives, he could have it. And so Sam slid back over the stud's rump and into the water. At that moment, his enemy was no more than 10 feet away. In the next moment, the Indian's chest came up, like an otter's, and in a flash he flung himself on Sam. In that same moment, Sam's powerful hands seized the red man's right arm and broke the knife from his grasp. The next move caught Sam unprepared. With fantastic speed, the Indian came up and almost out of the water, and both desperate hands seized Sam's throat. The move had been made like a trout's, in an arc, and with such perfect timing that for a few moments, as the hands closed his windpipe, Sam could only bog his eyes and wonder what had happened. He was to realize later that the Indian could have seized the knife at Sam's waist and plunged it through him. Like a horror in a nightmare of memory, Sam saw the grizzly with a badger's teeth set in its nose. With all the strength he could bring to bear from the position he was in, treading water, he took the Indian's wrists and tried to break the grasp. In that moment he was conscious of the red man spitting in his face. In that moment he caught a dreadful picture of eyes, so full of hate that they were like black molten steel, and of teeth bared back into the cheeks. Sam sensed next that blackness was about to engulf him, and with the last of his sanity he did the only thing he could do. He grasped the terrible knife at his belt and plunged it deep into the Indian, just under the breastbone. When the hands didn't instantly relax, he drew the knife and plunged it again. As he then fought to remain conscious, he saw the change in the black eyes, and that change he would remember to the day of his death. He was to think of it afterward as the kind of change a father would never want to see in the eyes of a son. Sam thought he must have been unconscious a few moments, for he had water in his lungs. Coughing, he looked round him and saw patches of red. The hands were gone from his throat, and the dead Indian was floating down the current. Putting the knife in his belt and looking at the far bank where his horses stood, Sam began to swim, keeping his head under, except when he turned his mouth up for air. Once, through veils of water hanging from his brows and lashes, he saw his two beasts moving toward a wooded area, a half-mile from the river. While he swam, the thought came to him that this intrepid youngster wasn't one of the 7 he had seen, but a lone warrior who had left his people to count coup or die. He was as brave a man, Sam was thinking, as any he had known, and after reaching the bank, exhausted and subdued, and feeling a strange shame, admiration compelled him to look down the river, hoping for a last view of this brave youth. But there was no sign of him on the slate-blue waters. He was dead, and he was gone. Sam drew the knife. The river had washed it clean, except for a tiny spot that had rested between belt and buckskin. With a forefinger, Sam wiped off the blood smear and then touched his skin over his heart. It was the only way he could think of to salute the valor of a foe who had been more than worthy of him. After running into the woods, he turned to look back. There was still no sign of the 7. Mounting the stud, he rode at a gallop west by north to the foothills and entered a black forest. He was feeling nausea and a sadness that was not at all natural to him. Riding by night and hiding by day, he began to wonder about a matter that only now had occurred to him. Here he was, a human male, hunted by 1,000 warriors from 2 nations, and yonder was Kate, a female whom all befriended and no man wished to kill. If the old Crow chief would now come to him and say that his people were sorry for the murder of his wife and child, and that the braves who killed them would be punished, he would sheath his knife and smoke the pipe of peace. It was true, he told himself, that Kate had killed in a frenzy of hate and passion that no man could excel and few could equal. But since then she had given her whole being to her children and their flowers. Sam doubted that she had killed anything, even a bug, since that terrible morning. She watered her plants, talked to her angels, and waited for the Lord to call her home. Whereas he, who only now had slain a brave boy, would soon join a war party that would try to exterminate to the last man and dog an entire band. He suspected that he wasn't thinking clearly. There surely were aspects of the matter to which he was blind. If the crows had him in their hands, there would be in their hearts no compassion and no mercy. And if the warrior in the river had been able to kill him, he would have become a national hero, possibly the greatest hero in all of Crow history. It was an eye for an eye, the Holy Book said. It was not Kate's devotion to gentleness that had made her secure. It was the mountain men who had set the skulls on 4 stakes at the 4 corners of her tiny world. If the laws of life, of weakness and strength, of timidity and courage, had taken their inexorable course, with no protection of the weak by the strong, she would have been scalped long ago, and her bones would now be white somewhere along the muscle shell. Just now Sam wondered, lying in his robe, did the Almighty want it anyway? Throughout the Creator's world, a man rarely, if ever, saw protection of the weak by the strong, except now and then in the human or in the dog family. When Sam was 17, he had seen 3 bully boys tormenting a helpless youngster about their age and size, with a dozen men and boys watching the torture without lifting a hand. Sam had gone in and knocked the heads of the three together with such force that he had fractured 2 skulls, and had made the whole community hostile toward him. When he walked the streets, mothers had come shrieking at him, who had no interest, none at all, in the boy who had been tortured, but only in their own brutal hellcats. Sam had been glad to get out of the place and away from the hate in the mother eyes. Of the mountain men he knew, he thought there was none who would take advantage of the weak or defenseless, much less torture for the hellish pleasure of it. In nature under the human level, as Sam had observed it, nothing killed except for food, or for mates, or in defense of itself or its kind. Human beings, in what they called the civilized areas of life, had brought killing down to such an ugly level that some men actually murdered for a handful of coins, or for the simple ghoulish pleasure of it. The red people made of war a philosophy and a way of life, as the bullfighter made of bull-killing. It was not a philosophy and a way of life with his country, which had recently jumped on a feeble neighbor and wrested from it half its lands, as stronger bobcats took the rabbit from the weaker. Jim Bridger said that back in Washington they were calling it manifest destiny. The Indians, warring against one another, seemed to be pretty well matched, man to man and nation to nation, or at least this was true of the more warlike ones. It seemed to Sam that the tribes that loved and sought war and made a philosophy of it, and killed in the full light and passion of heroism, when emotions were hottest, when a man hardly felt bullet, arrow, or knife, and when, if mortally wounded, he broke into his death song and died in a clean way, with his wings soaring. This, it seemed to him, was all right. Maybe the truth, he thought he saw it now, was that the youngster who flung himself into the river had died a wonderful death. In the last moments he had the enemy by the throat and was choking the eyes right out of his face, and his blood was boiling hot, and his hunger for glory was right at the gates of heaven. How many men in a country passed into death in such triumph? How many won such consummation of all their courage and powers in a last supreme blinding moment? All but a few of them died creaking and itching and complaining, scabbed and scarred over, half blind and half dead, sick with loneliness and self-pity, and as remote from triumph and glory as an old robin skulking along in forest gloom with its wings dragging. After thinking his way through it, Sam felt a little better. It was pretty heavy moralizing for a mountain man, and after reaching a conclusion he felt tired. He didn't perceive that his love of life was so inordinate and hungry, that killing for pleasure was as alien to him as asceticism, its inseparable twin. He'd far rather sing than shoot, far rather lie on his back in a field of alpine lilies or an orchard of wild plum and syringas, breathing in the marvelous scents that filled the atmosphere and the earth, than ride away to kill some man who was coming forward with the hope of killing him. He'd rather stand on a mountain summit and shout into the heavens the concluding bars of Beethoven's C minor than follow the bugles and Zachary Taylor to Resaca de la Palma and Buena Vista. In his moralizing, Sam felt the outlines of a symphony. A day or two later he reached the core of it. He had lost a son, and guessed he would never have a son now. He had lost one on the Little Snake, and one in the river. Sam was unable to put away the face convulsed by passion, and the black eyes hot with courage and hate, or the words which, among so many, his father had uttered aloud in troubled thought. And where the slain are, there she is, the eagle mother. He couldn't stop thinking of Kate, For where the slain were, there she was, in another world and another way. Still he guessed there wasn't much difference between the eagle mother and the human father and the wolf father. But over Kate's passions had fallen a heavenly light that was like the eyes of morning, the light of the living. It was this that perplexed and troubled him. God had said, but he could no longer remember of what or whom, that a light did shine, and eyes were like the eyes of the morning. And Job had said, I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eye sees thee. After a week of hiding by day and making his way north, Sam felt that at last his eyes were seeing Kate. As he sat astride his horse on a hilltop and looked over at her flowers. She had quite a garden this year. He saw that she had used some of the seeds he had given her. This indicated, surely, that she knew what she was doing, or that God was guiding her hand. Approaching, he thought her flowers lovely, though he preferred the wild ones, the columbines and lilies, and gilias, and 100 more. It looked to him as if she had planted a few columbines, if she had. The glory of their spurred petals would look as out of place in this arid and lonely region as the blonde curls and laughing blue eyes of a girl child. Kate now came inside out of the river woods, the pail in her hand. While she came up the hill, he studied her garden. She surely was making a loveliness of bloom and fragrance above her children, with the tallest flowers to the north and the others stepping down to the south. On the north side there was an open spot. It was there, he supposed, that she sat when she talked to her children or read from the book. When she came up with the pail, he called her Mrs. Bowden and asked how she was, but she didn't look at him. She was like a woman who, having only a small measure of awareness, gave it all to her flowers and her children. Telling her that he had cleaned and oiled and polished her rifle, he set it by the cabin door. He then quickly framed her face and kissed her forehead, saying, I'll get this pailful. But when he tried to take the pail from her hand, she made a wild female movement, and Sam stepped back. He studied her as she went down the hill. Each year she looked smaller and frailer and grayer. When she vanished into river brush, he looked over to the cairn, then at her sage plants and flowers, and at last at the long knife and heavy revolver hanging from his waist. This evening, while smoking a pipeful, he saw the moon come up. Soon she would be in the garden, talking to her angels. It was too bad she didn't have some trees up there. He wondered if he ought to transplant a river willow, or serviceberry, or aspen. If she had a grove of aspens, she could listen to the marvelous music of the leaves when the soft winds whispered over them, and find the joy in their golds and yellows in the fall. He guessed at last that he ought to go up and sit with her. She was by the flowers at the north edge, facing the sage plants, the book in her lap. Sam would have been amazed if he had known what she was thinking, for she was telling herself that not until this moment had she known how handsome her sons were, or how lovely her daughter. They hadn't grown at all since that night when they came out of heaven to kneel before her. But she hadn't thought about that. She might have said that angels didn't grow, but were always the same. Because the moon was full and golden like a melon, her daughter was exquisite in her loveliness, as she smiled and nodded at her mother across the sage foliage. She wore a heavenly filmy stuff, as delicate as spider gossamer, that no one had ever seen on earth, for it was not there. Kate couldn't see the shoulders of her sons, but she knew they were gowned in a silken radiance that was not of the earth. She read first to them Isaiah's words, "They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint." All day, while carrying water up the hill, she had murmured the words over and over, for she was waiting on the Lord as well as she knew how, and she was not weary. In her soul, with these words, had been the others. "The wilderness and the solitary place shall be glad for them, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose." Sam stood behind her, puffing his pipe and hearing her words, that the tongue of the dumb would sing, and in the wilderness waters would break out and flow away into the desert. A path would be there, and no killing beasts would be found there, and all sorrow and sighing would go away. The daughter and the son smiled at her, and all the flowers were softly nodding. And after a while the mother began to hum an old song that mothers in all lands sang to their little ones, and behind her a mouth harp was soft and low. Sam had backed away and now leaned against the cabin, his rifle at his side. Did she, he wondered, think the music was from heaven? Who could say it was not? After a few minutes he took the lead and played the simple themes that his mother had sung to her children, and in a low, tired voice Kate carried the words to his music. For almost 2 hours he played and she sang, and not once did she turn to look at him or seem to know that he was there. He then slipped silently out of her sight. The next day he thought to linger and play again for her, but reflection told him that this would be an unkindness. If she did indeed think the music was from heaven, it would be best not to overdo it, lest she find out that it was not. For the artist in him said that heaven had to be a thing that one could touch only rarely, and hope to touch once more. It would be best to slip away, for she now had an abundance of fruits and nuts, sugar and flour. He might come again this fall, after the Three Forks rendezvous, to lay in meat for the winter, and again open a heavenly window to let the music out, so that melodies of long ago could touch her soul in memory of her dead ones, hers and his. Chapter 31. The first of the Avengers to arrive in the Three Forks area was Bear Paws George Meek, a big, blond, smiling man whom men called Bear Paws, for his habit of collecting the claws of bears, chiefly of the grizzly, which he washed in urine and other astringents, and polished with clays and powders and leathers until they were as clean and gleaming as jewels. George was a happy-go-lucky fellow, or seemed to be. He had gentle blue eyes and a broad smile, and pleasant words for all men, except the Red, whom he despised because they had killed his brother. Under his jolly surface he was a sharp man with a bag full of tricks. He was always smiling. Bill said George smiled when he slept, and this seemed likely, for his dreams were usually of deceptions and stratagems and sharp practices, with which he outfoxed those who dealt with him. "Always try to get the saddle on the right horse," was his definition of himself. He cut his pants according to his buckskin. He sailed near the wind, and he never waded when he couldn't see bottom. But he was a convivial cuss who didn't like to live and trap alone through 5 cold months, as Zeke and Hank did, and Lost Scalp, Bill Williams, and Sam Minard. Poor old Bill! He was dead now, and Windy was writing a poem about him. He chomped life down, just all the laws of God allow, leastwise till now. They ain't no longer any sign he's climbin' up the hill. I 'spect he's had his fill. He had been found down in the Uintas, a bullet through his heart, and an old Utah rifle across his lap. There was 2 feet of snow on him. George had sometimes spent the winter with Hob Niles, dead now like Bill, who had shared his skill with hands. They had both carved things from wood, an artist's love of exquisite detail, and tall lies around a fire. They had both preferred chewing to smoking, and had brown beards on which the patches of deeper brown were the stain of tobacco juice. George had come up from Henry's River, and a few hours behind him came Tomahawk Jack, as mean a critter as ever scalped an Injun, and one of the best revolver shots in the West. Jack, like Dave Black, another expert with revolvers, was not much larger than Kit Carson, and had that man's feline instincts and small man deadliness. If Jack or Dave had ever smiled, it had been when looking at the dead face of an enemy. 35 and 38, the year the mountain men met at Three Forks, both were clean-shaven and rather boyish in appearance, and not much good in a fight, except with weapons. Jack was almost as skillful a rider as the best of the Crows, and his Crow horse was thought by some to be the fastest horse in the mountains. That, McBoone had said, his large, homely face cracking in a slow grin, was only because Jack was such a little man. He was bigger than Jack when he was born, Mick said. That, Bill had said, didn't mean a thing, except he'd always been a big target. The next of the mountain men to ride in was said by army men to be one of the 3 best scouts in the West. That, said the irrepressible Bill, was because McNeese saw twice as much as any other man. While one eye scanned the northeast, the other scanned the northwest. That he saw equally well with either eye, like a horse, was proved, Bill said, by the fact that he would look at you with either eye, and sometimes, like a bird, he would look at you with one, and if he didn't like what that eye saw, he would look at you with the other. In Roger McNeese, half Scot and half German, there was no monkey business, no sense of fun, and no tall tales. After he came west 15 years ago, there had been a rumor that he had slain his father and fled, but no man west of the Missouri knew if it was true, and no man cared. Three Finger loved tracking and scouting. It was said that he could stuff both nostrils with sage foliage and still smell out an Indian trail faster than a wolf pup on a rabbit track. The other man had supposed that he would do a little scouting on his way to the rendezvous, and so were not surprised by his reply to Meek's question. "Do you know where the varmints is?" He knew where they were, and he knew how many were in the pack. Did Bear Paws know where the sulphur springs were east of the Big Belts? "Well, as my own mother's face," said George. "I've been thar, man and boy, 1,000 times." Did he know where the creek was on which Black Harris had hidden from the Blackfeet 2 days and a night, when they sat so close to him playing roulette that one of them touched him? "Well, now," said George, "that was the time when Black's legs wouldn't work on leaving the hiding place. For miles he had dragged himself along by his arms. "Allus thought that was Broken Hand," George said. One black eye studied George. Did he know where the 7 Miles Creek was? "Well, as I know them all, on top of my pa's nose. It had 2 hairs in it. Halfway between 7 Mile and the Springs, you turned west to the Big Belts, and in no time at all the camp was plumb before you, as plain as the whiskers on a bull buffalo." "That ain't too far from here," George said. "How many?" asked Jack, scowling. "If the varmints were all in camp, there were 58. "One must have had a baby," said George. Sam had killed one, and 58, doggone it. Wouldn't be 3 apiece. As the nigger Stott said, 'twarn't no more than a few minutes' work. See elk horns? Asked Dave. Three Finger looked at Dave. Would I count him if I never seen him? You mean, said Dave bitingly, you seen his scars. He sees everything, said George quickly, for the two men were looking at one another. This evening Lost Scalp Dan and a dozen others came in. No man, not even the Cold McNeese or Tomahawk Jack, could look at Dan without feeling a slight chill. It was not that he was a big fellow, 6'2", and all muscle and bone, with a girth of 18 inches around his neck or his flexed biceps. It was not his big skull with neither hair nor hide on it above the ears. It was his eyes. 40 now, he had been a mountain man for 19 years. How he lost his scalp nobody knew, for not even the snoopy nose of Wind River Bill had been able to smell out the secret. Whoever took the scalp was a greedy cuss. The knife had made the incision where the top part of the ear was fastened to the scalp, but instead of pushing the top of the ear down and away, the Indian had slashed across it, so that Dan was earmarked and cropped like a steer. His big gleaming skull was all hairless bone, except a fringe above 2 inches wide across the back of his neck. Instead of cutting along the hairline on the forehead, the scalper had gone halfway down to the eyes, and now almost straight across and about an inch above the brows, Dan had an ugly scar that was like a welt. It seemed to fill with blood when he became angry. Powder River Charlie was speculating that if it was the Blackfeet who had scalped Dan, this foray would be for him a special pleasure. Charlie liked to tease a little, though he knew that teasing was for Dan like liniment in a raw wound. Dan, Bill had said, had the sense of humor of an old sick bull with a pack of wolves around it.
If they all got 3 apiece,
Charlie said,
they'd oughta give Dan the biggest one, for maybe it could be tanned into a wig for him.
Dan at the moment was puffing his pipe. He looked over at Charlie, not quickly, but like a man who took his time about things. His large, pale blue eyes seemed puffed softly out of his skull, like a toad's. He looked at Charlie, his large, strong, smooth-shaven face immobile, and George decided at this point that it would be safe for him to come in with a little flight of whimsy, like a jolly sally upon a besieger. And so, rearranging his quid, he said, "Trouble is, the red varmint didn't leave enough hair, so as we can match it, and the hair on a man's belly is never the same color as on his head. I'll be dogged and gone, if I can see how we can do it." Bare Paws looked round him slyly to see if his jest was setting well. Dan now turned his cold eyes on George and went on sucking his pipe. "Well, one thing you could say about Dan," Sam Minard might have said if he had been here, was that he had avenged himself on his enemies 10 or 20 times. Dan had a shack far up the Medicine, near the headwaters, and the only time Sam had looked into it, it had seemed to him that half the walls were covered with Indian scalps. Dan combed the black hair and glossed it up the way he did with beaver pelts, and as George put it, kept everything nice and purty. Once in a while, when his whole skull itched under mosquito bites, Dan would go forth to get another scalp. He always cut it across the ears and forehead and low on the neck. He was a lone and deadly killer. If Sam had been asked which of all the men he knew might give him buck anger if he had to face him in a fight, he might have thought first of Dan. The next morning there rode into camp the man whom all mountain men would have chosen by private ballot as the ablest of them all. It was not because Sam Minard was the biggest man in the West and physically the most powerful. It was not because he was the deadliest shot, there were many deadlier ones, or the most courageous, there were others more foolhardy, or that he was the coolest when faced with appalling challenge. Perhaps no man on earth had nerves of colder steel when confronted by charging grizzly or red man with raised tomahawk than Hank Caddy or Kit Carson, Lost Scalp Dan or Three-Finger McNeese. It was not because he was the most successful Indian fighter. In this, Kit or Dan or Jim Bridger or a dozen others were more than his match any day. It was because he had in ample measure all the traits and skills that made the superlative mountain men. There was none of Jeb Burger in him. Though Windy Bill was a brave man and a superb fighter in a pinch, there was a little of Jeb in him. Though Mick Boone would have faced any man on earth, he always felt gooseflesh when his life depended solely on his nerve. The men who gathered here, there were 23 of them before they rode forth, were probably as daring and able a group of warriors for their number as had ever been brought together. Any one of them could be put down for 2 Indians, most of them for 3, and a few of them for 4 or 5. In varying degrees, they were all eager for the fight. They all felt competitive, and some of them were straight afraid they would not get their share of the scalps. A few, like Dan and McNeese and Jack, were ambitious to be recognized as the outstanding killer where it was all over. Others, George for one, Hobe Isham, a quiet man for another, felt that they hadn't the killer talent to be first, and so would be content to do the best they could. A few, like Sam, David Black, and Z. Campbell, were strategists at heart, and killers only secondarily. McNeese said Scarface and his pack were encamped on a small stream against a sheer bluff with a heavy stand of timber on its crest. That was the west side. The prevailing wind when he was there was from that side, but the winds in that area were like a woman's mind and changed for no reason. On the north side and back about 50 yards was dense aspen and spruce. A stream flowed past on the south side. With the men gathered round him, Three-Finger drew on bare earth a map of the area. When he scouted their position, they had 2 sentinels out, one here, one over there, on the northeast and southeast points, and he supposed they had a lookout on the bluff above, though he had seen no sign of one. They had only 7 teepees standing. He had assumed that the largest, which stood in the center and back toward the bluff, was the chief's. It was possible that they had moved and would have to be scouted again. Looking up at a lowering sky, he said one hell of a storm was getting its belly full of water. If they could move in under thunder, that would be fine. George at last had been able to divide 58 by 23, and now said that some of them would be cheated. There wouldn't be 3 apiece, all the way around. There would be 3 apiece for 13 of them, 2 apiece for 9 of them, and only 1 for him. Someone said that Sam doth have an axe tree, since it was his hugging party, but someone else said Sam was to have the chief. A third suggested that most of the varmints should be divided equally, and the remainder should be axe-trees on a free range for the men who got there first. Sam now spoke up and said one of them should be allowed to escape to carry the glad tidings to the Blackfeet Nation, and Dan said that would be fine if he was scalped first. They would let Dan scalp him and then give the bugger a fast horse with a cactus under its tail. "Well now," said George, "lot of mathematicians here." Some of the men talked about the imminent killing of 57 Indians as if they were about to go on a buffalo hunt. Some, like Hank Caddy, said nothing. For nearly all of them, a red man was no more human than a black man. "They looks a little more like a man," George had said, But they isn't when you come right down to the marrow. When the Almighty made the engine, he had plumb run out of stuff, 'cept ferocities. They ain't no devil as hisses down in hell, half as froscious as a red varmint. Some of the men had come from points as far away as Bear Lake and the North Platte, and felt that 2 pesky redskins were lean pickings for a long journey. One of them said it was like riding 100 miles to eat 2 doves. If he'd knowed, Mark Hiller said, there'd be a whole army here, he would have stayed home. His pa would be ashamed if he saw his son riding 1,000 miles for 2 scalps. Maybe we'd best give him 3, George said. Me, I can stay and tend camp. Windy Bill thought that a good suggestion. Mark, he said, was plumb down there towards the other side of the world, almost to Bensfort, and he had crossed 50 rivers and 1,000 mountains to get here. Pretty soon, said George, there wouldn't be any extras left. They'd just have to let the man have them who first got their knives in them. That was about it, Zeke said. He didn't calculate any man would get his sights on anything. There would be no moon, and probably no fires. The night would be so black, it would be like crawling back into your ma's womb. That was right, Bill said, scanning the dark sky. They would have to tell by the feel of the skin if he was red or white. By the smell, Mick Boone said. But how was Sam to tell elk horns from wolf paws or beaver tail? It was David Black speaking, and when he spoke, according to Bill, his brain swelled up like a pregnant belly. "He will smell like a chief," George said. Sam, Bill said, would go to elk horns like a calf to its mother. But what if he didn't? Dan asked. Would the man who got there first hold him by the halter and wait for Sam? The chief, Bill said, had spit his stomach in Sam's face. He had smacked his jawbone with a tomahawk. He had tied him to a tree and near froze his gizzard out, and he had boasted and threatened almighty awful they would have to let Sam have him. He guessed Sam would have the chief by his topknot in less time than it took a wolf to turn around. The men spent 2 or 3 hours with their weapons. They examined the parts, cleaned and greased them, and wiped the barrels as gently as they would have touched the mechanism of a watch. Their knives they honed on fine-grained hard stone that they had saturated with goose oil, and then stropped them on soft leather. To their horses, and every man was superbly mounted, they gave a devoted care that they never gave to themselves, examining their hoofs, teeth, hams, and neck and shoulder muscles, searching under their flanks and up against their scrotums for ticks and other bloodsuckers, letting them drink only in streams clear of heavy clays and poisonous silts, and pasturing them in the most luxuriant spots. If 400 Blackfeet warriors had moved against them, their chance at life would have depended almost entirely on the strong beasts under them. A mountain man thought of his horse and his gun and knife as parts of himself, an extension of his reach and a trebling of his speed. When the 23 men in this comitiva felt that no more mountain men were coming, they spent another night here, waiting for storm, with sentinels in 3-hour watches at the 4 corners. The next morning they saddled their beasts, secured their bedrolls and fixins behind their saddles, and headed north down the Missouri. Ahead of the main body went 3 scouts, and a mile behind it the sharp-eyed Dave Black brought up the rear. A few of them, with Dan as their spokesman, had proposed that after this band was wiped out, they should push north and find another band. But the cooler heads said no, for they knew that the massacre would arouse the nation to wild frenzies. The squaws would slash their flesh and spill blood over themselves, and shriek and yell with such insane furies that the braves, like wasps spilled out of a nest, would rush around in all directions, their eyes wild for sign of something to kill. After all, Bill Williams would have said, if alive and with them, their job was to avenge the insults on the head of a mountain brother. After that, they would slip silently away down the valleys and through the forests in all directions but north, leaving the red hornets to wear themselves out in their tantrums. The important thing, they had all agreed, was to let one man live so that he could carry the news to his people. How they would shriek and gouge themselves when the lone survivor, his skull bald and red, told them what had happened. The first night out, they made camp near the foothills of the Big Belt Mountains. McNeese slipped in about midnight to report that the band was still there against the bluff, but showed signs of getting ready to move. Their lookouts were as before, one varmint a mile from camp on the northeast, another on the southeast, and possibly a third on the bluff. The wind was from the northwest. He calculated that it was about 10 miles to the Indian camp. The 3 sentinels would have to be taken out. The choice of executioners was given to Sam. He knew that it would be foolish to call for volunteers. They would all volunteer. Knowing that Dan was dying to be one of them, he assigned to him the varmint on the southeast. Because the one on the bluff would be the most difficult of the 3 to ambush, he gave him to Three Finger. He then looked round him at the men, and thought he saw in the night gloom a special eagerness in the eyes of Dave Black. "All right, Dave. The one on the northeast is yours." It was a dark night with wolves baying and the hoot owl forecasting storm. All the men lay down, but they were all awake. Listening, the only sounds Sam could hear were from a night bird, a wolf, and an owl. 2 hours later, the party rode 2/3 of the way and concealed their horses in an aspen thicket. The sky was low and dark, and huge drops of rain were falling when the men resumed their journey. How wonderful it would be, Sam thought, looking up at the dark, wet sky, if at the moment of attack the Creator would fill the world with a thunderous theme of vengeance, with chords like those that opened the fifth. They moved forward almost as silently as the wolf until they were met by the returning scouts. McNeese had told them that he and the other 2 would need only a half hour. Well, maybe, Sam thought, Dan was not as fast as the other 2. They were still 2 miles from the Indian camp when Sam, now leading the 20, was astonished to see a tall figure come out of night shadows, hesitate a moment, and advance toward him. It was McNeese, with a wet scalp in his hand. This was not the way Sam had planned it, and he was wondering about Dave and Dan when McNeese began to whisper around the group that everything was ready for the hugging. Dan and Dave were about a mile ahead, waiting. They had found all 3 sentinels dozing, and had one hand over their mouth and a knife through them before they could move. The camp was sound asleep. There were dogs in the camp, McNeese said. Their horses were southwest around the base of the bluff, and no guard was with them. They would approach from the southeast, for the wind that way would be in their faces, and those asleep would hear only the hurricane. Wah! Sam was thinking. No wonder the man was known as one of the 3 best scouts in the West, the other 2 being Kit Carson and Jim Bridger. Still whispering, McNeese said that as they approached there would be 5 tents in a row facing them. About 20 feet beyond them was a larger tent, in which the chief would be snoring and dreaming of glory. Around it, on the south in a semicircle, were 9 smaller teepees. Some of the varmints were not under cover, and because the rain might arouse them, it was best to hurry along. By the time McNeese had ceased whispering, the men had in mind a map of the situation, and they knew that in the 5 skin tents facing the east were the chief's mightiest warriors. Every man but Sam, whose mind was on the chief, hoped to be the first to reach the 5 tents. They moved forward in a drizzle of rain. After a mile, Dan came in from darkness and joined them. When about 300 yards from the camp, the party halted. The men would now creep forward as silently as the wolf, for each of them wore 3 pairs of moccasins. Each had a revolver in his belt and a long bowie. After 50 yards, Dave Black rose as if out of the earth and slipped forward with them. When Sam and the dozen men abreast of him were about 150 feet from the first tents, they stopped, resting on one knee and a palm, and Sam looked round him at the men behind. Not even the breathing of a single man could have been heard, but in any moment they expected to hear the dogs explode in alarm and fury. For another 50 feet they all slunk soundlessly forward, and then Sam straightened, a knife flashing in his hand. This was the signal. In the next moment the camp and the mountains behind it and the whole earth round about were shattered by a war cry that stiffened every sleeping Indian. In almost the same instant the men rushed forward at full speed, and the camp's dogs came awake. For a few fatal moments the red men were drugged by sleep and shocked by terror, and during those moments it was all over for most of them. Not one Indian in 5 knew what struck him. Elk horns knew. Sam took care of that. While the horrible cries were still echoing in the mountain night, Sam in a flash was between 2 of the sentinel tents and over to the chief. The red man came up fast and met Sam at the flap door. While racing forward, Sam had returned the knife to his belt, because at close quarters he preferred to fight with his hands. At the tent door he seized the man by his 2 arms and wrenched him with such force that the hatchet fell from his hand. In the same moment Sam spat in his face and then flung him headlong backward across the shoulder. He swung then to a guard who had rushed out of the tent and drove his knife through him, and the next instant he seized the chief, brought him to his feet with a jolt that almost fractured his leg bones, again spat in his face, and slapped a red cheek so hard with the flat of his hand that the chief almost fell. "It's me!" Sam roared in the helpless man's face, and again uttering the dreadful war cry, he seized the chief with both hands just under his ribs and heaved him up and straight over his head. He was then on top of him, bloody knife in his hand, and while the stunned chief lay helpless, Sam took his scalp. Scalp in one hand and knife in the other, he leapt back, and in morning gloom surveyed the scene. On his left he heard the footfalls of men chasing men. He heard a cry choked off in blood. Looking the other way, he saw a white man taking a scalp, and a bloody Indian rushing at him with raised tomahawk. Sam leapt, felled the man, and saved the life of Hank Caddy. Hank had always been a little careless in battle. What Sam was looking for was a live Indian to send as a messenger, and when he saw a redskin leap up from a half-dozen prone bodies and make a desperate spurt for freedom, Sam was after him like a cougar. He overtook him in about 100 yards and flung him down. He felt over him for weapons, but this brave had none. Sam turned the Indian onto his belly, knelt on his back, and cut leather strings out of the Indian's elkskin jacket. With these he bound the man's hands behind him and was securing him to a tree when he heard his name called. "Here I am!" Sam cried. It was all over by then. A few wounded Indians had fled with mountain men after them, who one by one returned with their scalps. No one yet knew if any had escaped. No one knew if McNeese had been right in his count. Sam and Bill and Mick walked among the dead, trying to count them. And George came up with his habitual smile and said one was dead over yonder and another over there. Had any of the varmints got away? They didn't know, Sam said. Dan and McNeese were out of sight, probably chasing someone. Had any mountain man got hurt? Well, there was Cy Gregg over there, limping like a man with a broken leg, and Tomahawk Jack, who in his eagerness at scalping had sliced most of the meat off 2 of his fingers, and Abe Jackson, whose collarbone had been cut in 2 by a tomahawk. So far as Sam knew, no white man had been killed. As for the dogs, they had all vanished into thin air, and Bill thought that some of the red devils might have taken to wings too. They'd never know until they had counted them. In full daylight, Sam and Bill and a few others tried to count the dead bodies scattered over the area, but couldn't agree on the number. Sam then turned to the wounded. Abe had a nasty cut all right, through his collarbone and the 2 ribs next to it, but like all mountain men, he pretended that it was nothing at all. It was because of his doggone awkwardness, he said. Some of the men chewed tobacco and gave him the quids, and Abe pushed them into the wound. Jack had made a small fire, and with a hot knife point was trying to cauterize and cicatrize his wounds. And Abe, watching him, said he could use some of that medicine. Even Three Finger had a wound, a knife thrust in his shoulder, and into it moistened tobacco was stuffed. Zeke had slashed himself across a palm. Another man, while chasing an Indian in the dark, had struck a tree and knocked 5 or 6 of his front teeth out. McBoone had torn a thumbnail off. Sam said they would examine the booty to see if there was anything any of them wanted, and then they would bend the barrels and burn the stocks off the guns. He told Hank to choose 5 or 6 men and ride Indian ponies back to their horses, and then go out and find elk for breakfast. There wasn't much in the booty that any man wanted. Some of them chose pieces of leather clothing or a tomahawk or a headdress. The rifles, furnished by the British so that the Blackfeet could wage war on Americans, were piled on a fire, and after their wood was burned off and their barrels were hot, the barrels were laid across stones, and a huge stone was dropped in the center of each to bend it. It was while bending a barrel that Sam was first startled and then astounded. He was busy 100 feet from where he had scalped the chief, when, glancing that way, he saw what he would never have thought could be. Elk Horns, in spite of the awful drubbing he had taken, was still alive. He was conscious. In fact, he was slowly and stealthily crawling toward Sam, a knife in his hand. Sam advanced on the Indian, and when 50 feet away, stopped and looked at him. It was the eyes that held his attention. Only in the eyes of Falcon, Wolf, or Wolverine, or of the young man in the river, had he seen such deadly hate. "I'll be doggone!" he cried, and other men came over to stand with him and look. George said, "Sam, I thought you killed the varmint." Charlie said, "Is this'n the one we sent to the Bloods?" "He's tied to a tree," George said. "Ain't no reason to send 2, said Charlie. "Which one do we kill?" Bill had come over. He looked at the bloody Indian, now lying flat and staring at the men. The red man had the exact look of a wounded beast that knew all the advantages lay with the enemy, yet was determined to fight for his life. He looked like a thing waiting and planning. The men saw the knife in his hand and expected him at any moment to leap up and charge. Bill said, "Well, now, anyway, he knows he done it. I figure Sam intends to send this chief and just cut the other in case the chief don't feel up to it. Sam, be that it?" "Might be," Sam said. George said, "Wouldn't it be more insulting to send the chief?" 10 times more. It surely would," Bill said. "Then who gets the other one?" "He's Sam's," Bill said. Sam was staring at the chief. He was remembering how this varmint had degraded and humiliated him, and how for days he had been close to death in winter desolation. But there was something in this situation that distressed him. Perhaps it was the eyes of all the trapped and helpless or wounded creatures that had looked at him during his years in the West, and looked at him now out of this man's eyes. There was the blue heron. In target practice he had once shot a heron on the bank of a river, only breaking a wing. The bird, tall and stately, had come walking down the bank and right past him with what he had taken to be contempt for him. He could never forget that experience. The bird, walking with superb dignity, had looked at him steadily with one eye as it approached and passed him and went on down the bank, its blue wing hanging. And there was Kate Bowden. Sam might have said, after trying to think his way through it, that in the eyes of all wounded or helpless things there was something that laid a hand on his heart. He was looking at elk horns when Tomahawk Jack went over to the chief, and pressing the muzzle of a revolver against the bloody skull, reached down and took the knife from the hand. It was then that Sam saw with greater poignancy the look in the eyes that he didn't want to see and was wary of seeing. Dan had been standing back, listening and watching. He now came over to Sam and said that if the chief was to be the messenger, he ought to be scalped properly, halfway down his forehead and right across the middle of his ears. Dan was eager to show how it should be done, but Sam said no. The chief had been scalped, and that was good enough. If Dan wanted to scalp the other one that way and turn him loose, that was all right. A bald head was a better warning than a dead Indian. They could tell them to tell their people that the 2 messengers had been sent for the reason that it was figured that one would be killed by the crows on the way. "Fine," Bill said. "That would heap insult on 2 bald heads." After thinking about it, Dan said it made sense. "Did he get to scalp the other one?" "Sure," said Bill, "and get it over with. We want breakfast." As Dan approached, the Indian bound to the tree began the death song. Then the song fell silent, and so far as the men watching could tell, the red man didn't flinch while his scalp was taken. Half of each ear clung to the topknot. The 2 Indians were placed side by side before Sam, with the points of knives held against their backs. Sam studied their faces. Then Bill said, "Sam, the chief's shoulder is out of joint." "It surely is." They could all see that it was when they looked at the position of the arm. From behind, Bill felt over the chief's torso and said that several ribs seemed to be broken. "Sam must have handled him a little rough," Bill said. Both Indians were trembling with hate and outrage. All around them they could see the dead bodies of their comrades and the pile of useless rifles. The chief was so shaken, so horribly humiliated, and so little in control of himself that his lips were drooling saliva and blood, and he was making water. George might have said that he was enough to draw tears from the eyes of a dead wolf. But Dan, McNeese, Jack, and a few others were looking at him as if they would have liked to skin him alive. They were thinking of the unspeakable tortures and agonies they would be put to if they were in the power of this savage. Dan would have cut his head off and hung it from a tree. Someone asked why the varmints were not taken to camp and tied up until after breakfast. Let the red niggers think about it a while. Sam said all right, they would do that, and then send them on their way, and he turned them over to Si and Charlie, who spoke a smattering of Indian tongues. The men then mounted Indian ponies and rode to their camp, and behind them on horses, their feet tied together with leather ropes under the horses' bellies, and their hands bound, came the 2 prisoners. Hunters returned from the hills with the choicest portions of elk and buffalo. Fires were built, and great roasts were hung from tripods, and thin steaks were laid on chokeberry limbs over red embers. Sam, Hank, and Bill were making hot biscuits. A dozen of the men were out in the vales and over the hills, gathering roots and wild fruits. After they had eaten over 100 pounds of flesh, with biscuits and berries, and each had drunk a quart of strong coffee, they sat back, chewing tobacco or puffing pipes. Bill took the pipe stem from his teeth and, like an Indian, made a sign with the pipe at the earth and the sky. It was a cardinal's wonder, he said, that Sam didn't bust the chief wide open, though, as it was, he'd done him plenty bad. He doubted the varmint would ever make it to his people. Some of his innards might be split open inside. "Sangre de Cristo," Jack said, and turned red with anger. "Did they pet the puissant wolf because they felt sorry for him? Thar warn't no mercy in these red critters, and for his own part, he'd feel uneasy if this chief was turned loose. He would arouse the whole nation against them. Would the varmints figure the chief had been freed because he was a greater chief than any white chief? And Sam didn't know that if Elk Horns was turned loose, he would be on his trail night and day till the last river ran dry. Why didn't they sell him to the Crows?" The proposal caught the fancy of a few of the men. Elk Horns captured Sam to sell him to the Crows, and Sam had turned the tables on him. Wah! That would learn them to stay on their own range. For a full minute Sam puffed his pipe and considered the matter. He didn't want to offend these men who had come a long way and risked their lives for him, but he didn't want the Crows to put a wounded man to fiendish torture and death. Whether, if he turned the chief loose, there would be any gratitude in him, he didn't know. The Indian might pursue him night and day as long as he lived, but Sam was thinking of the eyes of the youngster dying in the river. "No, I guess not," he said at last. "We'll send him back, and if he wants to come after me, I'll be ready for him." He looked over at the 2 men bound to a tree. "Bring them over here." The moment men moved toward the 2 Indians, they began their death song. Dan was looking at the Indian horse. He wanted the chief's horse, and all the men knew it. Most of them felt that Dan should have the horse, and the chief too, because for years he had roamed the mountains and prairies with his skinned head blistering or freezing in sun and winds. The chief's horse was a handsome spirited black. Knowing how the men felt, Sam said Dan could have the beast, and at once Dan saddled and mounted him, and sat proud and bone-balled and ready for war. As the 2 Indians were brought to him, Sam called Si and Charlie over. He told them to tell these 2 red men that they would be sent back to their people, and they would tell their people that if ever again they captured or tried to capture a mountain man, the mountain men would make war on them till there wouldn't be left as much as a sick old woman in all their lands. Be sure they understand you. While Si and Charlie spoke by turns in signs and Indian words, Sam studied the 2 Indian faces. In the face of the young buck, he saw only what seemed to be amazement. In the face of the chief, only sick, sullen, smoldering contempt and hatred. Maybe he should have given him to Dan after all. Sam had been thinking that as a gesture of kindness he would put the man's shoulder bone back in its socket before sending him on his way, but he now said to hell with it. A face as ferocious and evil as that deserved nothing. They were now to tell this chief that if he wanted to fight Sam anywhere, anytime, he was not to skulk around like a cowardly coyote. He was to come out like a warrior and a brave man into the open, where they would fight it out. Be sure that he understood it. Tell him he's to come any day, and the sooner the better. Again Sam studied the chief's bloody face. The expression now was not all sullen hate. Sam thought he saw fear, and he told himself that he would never see this chief again. The man's fighting will had been broken. What an abject, pitiable thing he would be, enduring for the remainder of his life the jeers and contempt of his people. Sam guessed it would have been more merciful to have killed him. Without knife, gun, or parcel of food, the two Indians headed north, afoot, and 23 white men stood in a group and watched them go as long as their red skulls were in sight. By noon the wolves and buzzards would be stripping the corpses. By tomorrow or the day after, the largest Blackfeet village would be like an overturned wasp nest. The men rode together to the Three Forks area, and from there, singly or in pairs or threes, they went southwest, south, southeast, or east, with a wave of the hand and the words, "Watch your topknot," or "I'll see you at the next rendezvous." Come another spring, they would not all be alive, but it was that way with mountain men. It was their way of life, and they would have willingly lived no other. Hank and Bill rode into the east with Sam. Bill said Mick Boone was broken-hearted because his bay hadn't been among the horses. Sam said he was awfully sorry about that. Maybe he should have kept the chief and traded him for the horse, and for his guns and knife, and for the lock of hair from his wife. He guessed he was getting old and foolish. After they had ridden east a day's journey and spent a night in a thicket, Sam said to Hank and Bill he would be leaving them now. They thought he intended to enter Crow country, but what Sam had in mind was Coulter's Billings and peace and rest. When Sam was out of sight, Bill said to Hank, "I'm awful uneasy about Sam. He just didn't act natural at all." Hank's marvelous gray eyes were looking in the direction Sam had taken, and his mind was remembering that the big man had saved his life. He spat a stream of brown juice and said nothing.